Okay, we're off. Public art, what is it good for? Before we get to that, can I just say how fantastic it is, isn't it, to be in this room, in this theatre? Yeah. It's probably not in the rules or anything, but I can tell you that standing on this stage with every single seat out there, the ones you're sitting in, but also the 2 layers above you, all so close to the stage, it's an incredibly exciting theatre. And when we finished, either on some other time come and have a look, or maybe when we finish, just come up on stage and have a look. It's a really, really terrific theatre, and so looking forward to being fully back in use. Public art, what is it good for? I would like firstly to thank the partner sponsors, Resine and Jib, and also the program supporters, Brookfield Lawyers, Buffer Miskell, Architectural Designers New Zealand, MR Cagney, New Zealand Institute of Architects, the New Zealand Planning Institute, and the New Zealand Green Building Council. And I can tell you also this event is brought to you in association with Metro magazine. I am Simon Wilson, the editor of Metro. What we're going to do this evening is Councillor Alf Filipaina will be out here shortly to do a mihi. Then we're going to hear from me again, and then Mary Jane Jacob. And after that we will have a panel discussion with some other guests, and also good time for questions from the floor. So get those ready, and we'll get to that later in the evening. So first of all, I would like to call onto the stage Councillor Alf Filipaina.
Tēnā rā koutou katoa, ko te mihi tuatahi ki te atua, nā e hanganga mea katoa, te whare etu nei e tēnā koe. I acknowledge our Creator above. I also acknowledge the house that we're sitting under. Ka mihi atu ki te kingi Māori tūheitia, kia te whānau pani. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, a tēnā tātou katoa. I just want to acknowledge our kingi Māori. E ngā mana, e ngā reo, e rauranga tira mā, nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai. To all our rangatira that are here, I say welcome, welcome, welcome. Ki a koe te rangatira Mary Jane. Ka mihi ki a koe, nau mai, haere mai, whakatau mai. To our rangatira Mary Jane, I say to you welcome, welcome and welcome. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, a tēnā tātou katoa. For those that don't know me, my name is Alf Filipaina, and for those that have sunglasses, please put them on if the shirt is too loud. For me, in regards to welcome you to this place, I want to first acknowledge my council colleagues and our Deputy Mayor, Penny Hulse. Welcome back from seeing your son. So I'm mihi to you, and also to our champion, and that's our urban design champion, Councillor Chris Darby. I also acknowledge you. To all our local boards, members that are here, I saw Mark earlier, and I'm just trying to, all the rest, kia ora. Tēnā koe. So for all our local board members, I want to acknowledge you as well. And welcome to this place. And to all the people that are regular attenders to the Auckland conversations, I want to also acknowledge you and say welcome. The Auckland plan calls for us to integrate arts and culture into our everyday lives through a number of very bold targets. And 2 of the strong priorities are to value, foster Auckland's cultural diversity, and to value our artists, our creative sector, and our cultural institutions. I chair the Arts, Culture and Events Committee, and as such am charged with the championing of the very projects that deliver on this plan. My committee gets to view and review the work program and the projects that bring these words to life. We are also responsible for guiding the plans that have made this all possible. As a community interface for consultation on our arts policies and a forum for community engagement and hearing community concerns, we have an important role in making sure Aucklanders are well represented when it comes to arts and culture And at this point, I want to acknowledge all our staff and people at Auckland Council, not only in our arts, but also in our culture and our events team, because if it's not for them, they are the people that make our public art possible in Tamaki Makaurau. So I want to acknowledge our staff at this point. I'm also delighted to be here this evening to hear Mary Jane speak and listen to the discussion on the value of public art. And before we get started, can you please put your hands together for all the people that have made this possible? Just want to acknowledge you and say thank you. Lastly, please enjoy your evening. Whether we answer the question, what is public art good for, or not, I'm sure there's going to be some great debates and some food for thought. Mary Jane told me that she was just so happy the Chicago Blackhawks won the NHL. So can you please put your hands together for the Chicago Blackhawks and winning the Stanley Cup? And again, I say welcome and good luck. Thank you.
Thank you, Alf. It's my very great pleasure to introduce Mary Jane Jacob. I was in Buenos Aires not so long ago. They have a lot of official art in the streets in Argentina. Most of it is sculptures of soldiers, often on horseback, always with swords, as you might imagine. There's an official response too. There are some really magnificent examples of the pain and suffering of Argentinians that has also been rendered into sculpture. And there's an unofficial response in the streets. The city is full of life-size painted concrete mannequins. They're comedians. They are the much-loved opponents to the fascist regime who were allowed a voice and used it as best as they could. So you can now, in Buenos Aires, you can sit on a bench on the footpath with them, you can put your arm around them, you can take a selfie. It's tremendous, and it's deeply unartistic. It's folksy and anti-aesthetic, and it has a tone that speaks, to me, of a culture that's lost its way. And it raises the question, as all sorts of things do, of public art, what is it good for? There's a conference on at the moment up at the Elam School of, being organised by the Elam School of Fine Arts at the university, along with arts faculties at Shandong University and Shanghai University. And it's about how is it valuable in the process, how is art valuable in the process of making better cities. They've got a competition, a public art competition, and the finalists included things like a floating school on the lagoon in the middle of Lagos in Nigeria, and a restaurant in America that serves only food from countries that America oppresses. The finalists also include Coralie Wynne and Trent Hulse representing the Palette Pavilion in Christchurch. The winner was a work by the Indian artist Jasmine Patheja, in which she set up a series of tables and chairs on a street in Bangalore where women had often been attacked. People got to tell their stories. It was called Talk to Me. Art is sometimes much more than what you think it is. So what is public art? Something decorative that we like or hope to like? Mary Jane Jacob, whom we are honoured to have with us this evening, has railed against what she called plop art in her time. Plop art, art that gets dumped on a landscape. I guess we know what she means from the Pohutakawa flower. But that's easy to say, isn't it? Do we also know what she means when a corporation buys the sky above the height plane for its building with a piece of sculpture or plop in the glass-walled foyer? Sometimes, yes. Do we know what she means when an artist paints garish colours on the ground outside a rugby stadium because he thinks it's, I don't know, deep and meaningful? I'm sorry, I'm just throwing it out there. Billy Apple will have champions in the room, I'm sure. And you should feel free to throw things at me later on. Words, I mean, use your words. Public art, is it something that engages us more deeply and more imaginatively with the place in which it exists? Is it something with purpose? Or is it something that confounds purpose, and that becomes its purpose? I met a very erudite man last night called Lewis Biggs, and he had a phrase he used distastefully in relation to what we find in galleries. He called it art that is made to become art that is made to become part of the history of art. He meant art that goes straight into a gallery, and everyone who engages with it does so with the weight of art history filling the room. Art that gets handed straight to the experts, not to the public. Public art is art in the streets. It's art that intrinsically has things to say about the place it is in and the world we are all in. It's art as a tool for action, a tool for the imagination, a tool for building the sense of community. And it should be bloody good, of course, whatever that means. Mary Jane Jacob is famous for culture in action, the idea of engaging artists in direct partnership with community members to explore the changing nature of public art and its relationship to social issues. She's also famous for Places with a Past, which was an exhibition rooted in the site specificity and the history of Charleston in South Carolina. Nearly 25 years ago now, it was described as the most moving and original exhibition in the United States. She's explored the relationship of Buddhism and art, and after serving as the chief curator of the Museums of Contemporary Art in Chicago and Los Angeles, she shifted her workplace from the museums to the street. In 2012, she was awarded a curatorial research fellowship from the Andy Warhol Foundation to support her investigation of the history of site-specific art. She is currently Professor of Sculpture at the School of Art Institute of Chicago and the Executive Director of Exhibitions and Exhibition Studies, but she tells me the academic titles are not really quite so important, certainly in this context. She's been responsible for some of the most significant, game-changing public artworks and experiences of the 90s and the new century. And because of all that, she's got a few things to say about public art. Mary Jane Jacob.
Thank you, Simon, and thank you to the organizers. It's great to be a first-time visitor to New Zealand, obviously to Auckland too, and I've had a chance to see some of your beautiful cities, so I appreciate you sharing it with me and that we could also have this evening to talk a bit. So I will say some initial remarks and look forward to the conversation that will include any and all of us. This topic, which was handed to me, what's public art good for, is one I'm quite happy to address and have us all talk about. At the same time, it might seem like a really odd, why are we going there with this question, when some of us, like myself, curator and art historian, the Auckland Council is evidently mandated to undertake arts and culture programming. So you'd think we would have figured out this thing that art was good for something, or else why do we all have these jobs and this legislation going on and these folks that are here and convening us this evening. And yes, we have figured that out, what's art good for, and yet it's a constantly revisited subject, and I think that's a good thing. Because we know on a popular level, or at least in my experience, in my country, that art is still associated with the luxury of having money or the luxury of having time. So something that's possible when the real work is done and there's free time. So art gets associated with entertainment and leisure and something different and apart from everyday life. And while we all like to be entertained and that has value too, somehow there's a side of that that makes it sound less important. And it's that apart from everyday life thing that sticks in my craw and I think is a bit of an issue. There's also the popular perception, and we help foster that, we in the art world, that art is a specialty. It's somebody's professional expertise. It's somebody's skill, or it's his or her self-expression. So there's this popular perception, of course, that art is something you need training for, both to make and to look at it. So we de facto kind of alienate our audiences from the get-go. So why public art has a problem is something I think the art world self-inflicts. And so when I think about public art and I think about agencies like the Auckland Council or my own role in and out of different organizations working with this thing called public art, I think that what we all share is a mission that, along with making artworks and making them available for public viewing, is a mission that is to dispel these misconceptions that I talked about, that we in the field perhaps unwittingly convey. So to get our point across, that is that art is open to everyone and not just for collectors or for experts or for people who carry those titles, I think we need to demonstrate in real terms that art has a place in life, and that means that art has a use, that it is good for something. It's not just a point we can take for granted. Now, before we talk about the use of public art, and I show you some examples of some public art works, I want to just pause for a moment to acknowledge that this thing that we call public art is a 20th century invention. So we might imagine the public art per se was not required in centuries prior, that previously there may have been a condition where culture was more pervasive and also more cohesive, that there were rituals and traditions that connected people to each other and provided meaningful life-marking experiences, both personally and communally. I think in a place like New Zealand, with your phenomenal marriage of Maori and Western culture here, that you know some of what I mean and what would have been Maori culture in the past and trying to acknowledge now. We also might imagine that Maori culture or other cultures in times other than our own were not so separate from life, and that art really played some part in family and community and public life, that we wouldn't quite have the same question of what's it good for, but we also wouldn't even have this term public art. Now, instead of thinking back to that, I don't want to, in a broad sweep, say that it was a rosy or even kind of artsy way of life prior to the modern world, or imply in some way that everything was good in a more remote past, but nonetheless, with the rise of industrialization, which is what we call the modern world, and the growth of cities, there was a division between how things that are made in art and life related to each other. And at the same time, we had arise this notion that freedom, too, could exist on a popular level, and there would be the possibility to realize this. And so it's no accident that the desire to make art more publicly available in the West, at least, starting in the 19th century, led to a rise of public museums and public parks and community art programs and art within a public education system. And I want to start really my remarks with that period, that turn from that 19th to 20th century, and to think a little bit about the job that public art does. I'm going to lean on the American philosopher John Dewey, because he was somebody who, working in Chicago and New York, but being our public philosopher from the mid-1880s right up to his death in 1952, really was somebody who came to define what was democracy for the United States, was influential beyond that, as you might imagine or even know. But he also, in his work in spanning these two centuries, lived through a time of phenomenal social change that was brought on by industrialization, and levels of cultural migration that had never been seen or felt, and with that, a loss of family and community. And with that as well, social injustices that to him were a result of capitalist greed. So in this period, which was great growth and advances in science and fears of science, to world wars, religious fundamentalism, and more, we have somebody who was thinking through this in a world that actually doesn't sound so dissimilar than ours. Dewey lived in a crisis-ridden world on a global scale, and that's our world too. Well, with all of those problems, some of you might think, yeah, so art's irrelevant because we've got that real business to do. But I'm here to say that John Dewey thought this was our restorative way out. Art really had a job to do to repair society. And it's because he saw two interrelated, interdependent, primary uses for art. And the first is that art, and art made available to the public, aids us in our own self-realization. Art is the way we make meaning in the world. More than recreation, art was recreation. It offered us a way to grow. It gave us, quite literally, a greater vitality. And in feeling alive, we're vitalized. And that, to him, is what can happen in the experience of art. Now, this doesn't happen with every work of art. This doesn't happen every time for us. Doesn't happen for everyone in the same way. But when it does work, we have what Dewey, in very unhighfalutin terms, could only best describe as an experience. It's something that we integrate into ourselves. We take it in, we embody it. It makes meaning for us, it changes us. And I'm going to assume that everybody here has had an experience like that, has had an experience with art, or otherwise, you're really curious, but maybe, maybe wondering yourself why you're here. But I'm going to assume that everybody's had some reference when I talk about this that has brought you to such a forum as tonight. And for Dewey and for ourselves, when we have that experience, it's not that you are now in somebody else's career, or that it's just a thing that you do at a break in your time. It really becomes an experience which is a lived experience. And we take that with us, and we forget that, and then we remember it when we need it. And it transforms itself. So as Dewey saw those experiences, they're the things that help us grow in consciousness. And when we grow in consciousness, we gain a greater awareness of the world, and within that, our place in it. And therefore, there is a sense and a possibility for agency. That is, that we can think about how we take our own steps, our own actions in the future to determine our own path, and hence our self-realization. But Dewey, who was this spokesman for democracy, also reminded us that with this agency comes responsibility. So for this philosopher who was always balancing the rights of the individual with those collective needs of society, we arrive at the second great use for art to Dewey. And that was to encourage us to build a democratic society and a healthy planet. Because art communicates values. There's something in that work. There's something that touches you when you have that experience. And the very nature of art itself was, to Dewey, something which can embody democratic values. It is something which allows us to actually embody and feel and know in another way what is equality, what is fairness, inclusiveness, tolerance, and freedom. And the reason that art can do that is because of two intrinsic aspects of art. And the first one, I'm going to see if okay, sorry, I'm going to go back. Okay, hopefully we're on track. So the first thing that is intrinsic to art that helps us have this possibility is that art has an exceptional ability to evoke feelings of empathy. That is, to enable us to understand the circumstances of others who are different than ourselves. He wrote, "Works of art are the means by which we enter through imagination and the emotions they evoke into other forms of relationship and participation that are different than our own." So Dewey thought that art was useful in bringing about a deeper understanding of the human condition and a wider cultural understanding. So we see that in works like that of Chilean artist Alfredo Jar, who worked with the subject of the genocide, traveling himself multiple times in the mid-1990s to Rwanda to understand this senseless horror. We can also look to the work of the artist Seamus McGuinness, who has undertaken a process that he calls a visual arts autopsy, working with 102 families throughout Ireland who have lost family members to suicide, predominantly young men, teenage boys, and working with them alongside a psychiatrist, Kevin Malone, for nearly a decade now, making a broad public work that as a national suicide study has been taken on, so has this broad national visual arts autopsy. Another expression is the work of Korean artist Kim Soo-ja. Her work, A Needlewoman, is one in which she embodies a sea of humanity. To Dewey, this kind of evocation of empathy allows us to be brought in touch with something beyond ourselves, and we become conscious of that greater whole. We become conscious then of the consequences of our own actions, and therefore the chance to cultivate a more responsible role in society. But because life is constantly dynamic, always progressing and falling apart, experiencing art from time to time can be a way to re-find ourselves and contend with the world. So I hope you get some idea that Dewey's urging of the role of art in public society and of artists in public was really critical. And that was not just because it's important for us to have beautiful things and satisfying experiences, though he would very much acknowledge that that's important, but because art is a means of us living life. It is a way we can live life and understand life. Now, the other thing, in addition to empathy, that is intrinsic to art is imagination. These sound very basic, but I think we forget how powerful these common words are. And Dewey wrote, "The first stirrings of dissatisfaction and the first intimations of a better future are always found in works of art." So art's imaginative capabilities, insightfulness, and openness come to be a catalyst in his mind for social change. And art for positive, democratic, social change was the useful thing that Dewey thought art could do. Now this doesn't want to advance, okay. Now we come close to what Dewey was talking about when we consider today's socially engaged art. which is an art that transgresses the realm of the art object. We're not always talking about a sculpture. And art that, in fact, can leave behind art-making processes that we know. It may be sculpting society and performing with people than working with clay or stone or metal. And it is also an art that enters into the realm of life as an aesthetic practice. How do we live our life? If the artist makes their art their life practice, how can we make our life practice our art? So I want to share, before we turn to the group, a few examples. The artist Greer Twiss, who is Thai in part, but has lived and been born elsewhere in the world, born in Buenos Aires, has returned in part to Thailand, to Chiang Mai, where he has bought a former rice field and working with a village to create that rice field into a sustainable product for those individuals, but at the same time sharing that space, and doesn't want to advance so much, sharing that space with other artists and biologists and scientists who come to use this as an experimental testing ground for sustainable ways to live on the land. An artist who, while living a career of, I'm sorry about why this is, living a career of high profile in centers, is nonetheless finding his own personal center, spending more and more time in carrying out this work and life with community in Thailand. Chemi Rosado, Chemi Rosado is an artist in Puerto Rico. He is formerly, we might say, a street kid turned artist, but somebody who has created a work which is called All the Town is a Work of Art. You're looking at this piece. As redevelopment and change has happened on that island, an island smaller than your own, areas that were not in any way of interest to developers because they were far from the shore became increasingly of interest because property becomes scarce. And so now mountainous areas that had previously been these more informal housing, we might call them slums, but informal housing areas became very important to take over and to move these individuals out so that other kind of high-end housing could be built there. Chemi had the idea that within this green mountainscape, if the government wanted this community to go away, he would make it go away by offering to everyone for their house to be painted a shade of green. Oop. Now it goes of its own. Go back. And this action in bringing about by making, if you will, this community less visible by receding into the mountainscape also brought their cause more visibly forward. This community is still there, and with this artist thrives. Another artist, Juan William Chavez, artist of Peruvian descent, living in St. Louis, so in the Midwest of the United States, became very interested in an already green space in his city, one of these industrial cities of the Midwest United States that has seen a decline in the post-industrial world. Now, one of the things that St. Louis is famous for is one of the largest and most infamous social housing projects in the United States called Puet-Igoe, and you see it here. The architect was Yamasaki, the architect of the World Trade Center. So it was a very important site when it was built. But this is what it became, and you see Yrjö Saarinen's arch in St. Louis in the distance there. A giant, empty vacated space within the middle of the city, a kind of void that's sucking the energy out of this place. And over the years, however, by being fenced off and this, if you will, heart or giant center of the city vacated, nature takes over. And Juan became interested in visiting this site, curious around this site, jumping over the fence in this site, to discover that it was an enormous garden now, that it had become a kind of central park in St. Louis, and began to make propositions of just what this space was about and how it could be a resource and an asset for the community, and to begin to allow the community in and to develop it. He came up with the imaginative notion of Puet-Igo honey. We all know that we're going to be gone if the bees are gone, but the bees love this giant city garden. And that was one of his interventions within this space. It also meant looking at what the surrounding area was, including a nearby elementary school. And an artist who began as a painter had to learn beekeeping. One of the layers of where he's going in terms of helping a giant city to rethink itself and reimagine itself. Theaster Gates is an artist in the south side of Chicago, where not industrial but housing stock has been disused, abandoned in a post-60s race riot era. And he began to, as a young African-American artist, begin to develop that and acquire some of this housing, which was quite inexpensive to do. And thinking about how he could, through the power of the artwork and expanding the practice of what constitutes what an artist does, actually be a generator for local jobs, for training for a new kind of industry, and economically reaffecting and changing this area. In essence, what Theaster Gates is doing today is, through his own self-propelled and self-amassed funds, being able to create a kind of cultural district among this housing stock that was otherwise disused, which includes not only libraries, taking from places that were divesting themselves of their assets, like the Prairie Avenue bookstore, going out of business, a great architectural store, and being able to buy up the entire contents in order to make an architectural design and urban planning library in the middle of this disused and, one would think, impoverished African-American community. Taking another house and creating the Black Cinema Center, where African and African-American artists, this is a very slow, sad battery here, where African-American artists and African artists from all over the world come and show their films and enter into discourse around what their art is. So the Black Cinema House. Another project was a housing project that he has now reconceived to become an artist collaborative housing area, trying to allow more artists to move in there and economically live. So how do you create a housing project for artists? Whoops, we don't have to, sorry about this. Milo, you got an idea? Okay. Yes, so anyway, we don't have to wait for the city to do it. There is the possibility to bring those resources together with a vision of the artist entrepreneur. And his latest project, if the slide will turn, his latest project, which will open with the first Chicago Architecture Biennial this October, is the Stony Island Arts Bank. So a great classical building that was a bank, as banks looked, and and actually turning that into art dollars and creating a magnificent space for performance and other activities. But what Theaster is doing in that kind of neighborhood is not the sole activity which artists are engaging. And another such artist is Emmanuel Pratt, who has developed a system of how to engage families, turn them into educational experiences which can lead to careers and which can change the economy of this neighborhood. Again, you see that kind of possibility which sits dormant, which we otherwise would consider to be urban blight and maybe to be mowed over and wiped away. But how do you take these kind of spaces and as well the land which relates to these spaces and is available and turn them into assets? His Prairie Avenue Community Garden is a thriving enterprise, as is as well his aquatic endeavor of hydroponic growing of vegetables and as well fish, and carrying all of that out with youth who are learning the biomechanics of those processes, as well as the capabilities and where their food comes from and how they are part of a greater system. If Dewey thought we needed to learn how we're part of a greater world to affect the world, then to live this fully embodied experience of the world is what this artist offers. And of course, part of the wonderful thing that growing food does is that we get to learn how to cook it and then we get to eat it. So all of these things, again, thinking systemically within a larger public sphere as a public artist as to who are your partners, what does this mean for business, what does this mean for community, and how do they all partake as makers within this kind of endeavor. Now, as Simon mentioned, the winner of this wonderful international award for public art, Jasmine Pathaja from Bangalore, has done another kind of work which tries to deal with a social problem and have a change, make an effect, the artist as a social catalyst, with one aspect of her multi-legged piece, but Talk to Me, these conversations, these very intimate endeavor to face each other, but as she said, in really sitting down to talk and creating a work which, okay, we could call it a street performance, but creating a work where people for the first time talk to each other, one of the revelations becoming of finding that there were more people on both sides, that is male and female, more people who were walking in fear of each other than intending to harm each other. How do we come to know what this is about? So I want to end with a few interrelated works, which are only some of many actions and endeavors over decades of Chicago artists around some sadly interrelated issues of police brutality, unjust imprisonment, and harsh imprisonment. Of course, this is one use of public art. So what's public art good for? Here's one of the great plazas of Chicago by Mies van der Rohe, the Federal Plaza. Those are those black buildings that you see there, an office building and post office, and with one of the great 1960s works of public art, Flamingo by Alexander Calder. And well, it's good, you know, they knew the red was there, so this banner about people against police torture, that's a good use of public art. Whoop. And as part of these protests, which artists might choose to be part of, We have also in Chicago had artists become motivating factors in looking at what is the relationship of this city of Chicago, of the state of Illinois, of the United States. One of the points brought out by President Obama in his speech last Friday about if we're going to look at the problem of race in America, we need to look at the demographics of imprisonment and how that happens and why 1 out of every 10 black males ends up for a time in jail and in prison. Now, one of the artist projects coming out of Chicago was a proposition to create a public artwork. It was called the Chicago Torture Justice Memorial. Now, you might have controversies here. You can imagine the idea of the city wanting to put up a memorial or a sculpture in honor of the victims of their own police department's brutality. But anyway, the gallery that I oversee at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago hosted this exhibition, Opening the Black Box, and there were submissions from all over the world of people not only empathizing with a situation in Chicago, but tragically identifying with it from their own countries. A related project at that time may or may not come up. Okay. Do you have the option to advance? Okay. Was the Tams Year 10 project. Tams is a town in southern Illinois that has a solitary confinement prison. This artist, Lori Jo Reynolds, had undertaken initially a poetry project, working with prisoners, sending them poems, and creating a writing program. Again, people who were in solitary confinement. But with the responses that she was getting and the involvement which she had, she became more and more knowledgeable about what were those circumstances. And in working with people, from social workers to the wardens themselves, and of course on into legislators and the governor, seeing the truly excessive punitive aspects and debilitating situation that I think we can all quickly imagine solitary confinement is. During the run of her show in our gallery, and she had been working at that point for about 10 years on closing this solitary confinement prison. In fact, she and the family succeeded. Okay. And some of the folks joining that campaign. The last one I want to show you, again related, these are people in a population all quite close to each other but working on these related issues, is a collective called Lucky Pierre, who one of their projects is called Final Meals. What they have done with this public work, Final Meals, I say public work because it is about a public project, but doing a personal, solitary, very private meditation on death. They have enacted individually preparing and then eating one of the meals of these menus as listed on a website from the Texas penal system of what prisoners have requested as their last meal before they were executed. So each individual taking on one of these meals and enacting it. And they said to me last year that their dream was to do this as a communal activity, to have a large meal and to somehow find some solace in that as a public manifestation, as a communal identity. So what we did was to, first of all, cite this final meal in the dining hall of Jane Addams, the great settlement house founder in the 1880s in Chicago called Hull House, and Jane Addams being one of the partners with John Dewey in creating social reforms in my city. I also put together a group of about 40 students from around the city of Chicago, from 7 different universities, who joined a program to live a lived experience of contemporary art and join us in thinking about those issues. And as well, then people from around the city, from various agencies and walks of life, who might find this powerful moment important to partake in. What these individuals also had a chance to do in silence, eating, and then in listening, was to hear Benneth Lee, who had been imprisoned for nearly 30 years for a small crime, but excessively escalated, finally being released and creating his own organization to help those who try to re-enter life. And they got to hear Geraldine Smith. Geraldine, who was imprisoned for 19 years, the only woman on death row in solitary confinement for that reason, for a crime she didn't commit, for being, unfortunately, the person on the street corner, easy to pinpoint when those who were, in fact, culpable fled, and at that point, with her 3-year-old child, having that child taken away from her and herself put in jail for 19 years. She also, in being vigilant in writing letters to lawyers till she finally succeeded in finding somebody who took on her case, and yes, won, has also been somebody who has given back and created an organization for women who then leave incarceration. Coming back to that police brutality subject, I want to say that one campaign which artists in Chicago also organized was for there to be reparations to those who, it was acknowledged, had been victimized, brutally attacked when arrested by police in the city. There was the hope that those reparations would be great enough that out of that, all of those individuals agreed those funds would be used to create a community center, which would be one of counseling, one of services to those who also, again, try to deal with their life in society, and all agreed that an important part of that community center would be art. Well, some millions of dollars have been given to these individuals, not enough to do that job yet, but artists are pretty tenacious, as you're getting a sense. And the point is that as of May this year, the city admitted its own fault in this, and simply to have that happen with whatever funds came is rather a miracle of art. So that's public art in Chicago. And as you can see, a city where John Dewey lived a very formative period of his life at the turn of the last century, creating laboratory school for new education, working with Jane Addams and others, but professing his belief in art has somehow gotten in our DNA. But I would like to say, I think it's a damn good use of art. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary Jane. I'd now like to welcome out onto the stage Hannah Scott, who is the Arts and Culture Programming Manager for the City Council, and Nat Cheshire, who calls himself a delineator and really just likes to throw bombs of ideas whenever he can. Fair enough? hearing that? I'll go over here. No, you can.
Yeah, okay.
Over here. Thank you. There. So Hannah, of course, in her job as Arts and Culture Programming Manager, has quite a bit to do with the... Not hearing it? I'll go over here. Hannah, in her job as Arts and Culture Programming Manager, has quite a bit to do with the public art we see around Auckland. Nat Cheshire has been one of the key people who has designed game-changing civic projects in this city, including Britomart, the City Works Depot, a number of other places, made the city a very different place to be in. What I wanted to do first off, actually, is ask Hannah and Nat if you have any initial responses to Mary Jane's speech. Either of you like to kick off on that?
I think Hannah wants to.
It's very, very inspiring to hear about projects that have the potential to create change in the way that has been described tonight. So I guess my responses in that space are some of those projects I'm not aware of. Some of them are very local to where you're from. And that's been really inspiring to hear about.
Are you hearing that at the back? No.
Oh.
Good, our guy, yep.
Right, so everyone
Can you
needs
hear
to
that
speak
though,
up.
right? Can you hear that? Okay. I'm going to move it up here. Is that better? All right.
So, can I ask a question?
Yes.
So I said I'm new to Auckland and I just came on Tuesday. Do you have any problems here? Social problems?
No, none of those.
Okay. Well, make that sculpture stuff then. Yeah, enjoy it.
Yeah. Well, that's the point, right? That the really exhilarating thing about that is that so much of that work is so highly politicized. And it's so kind of situational, and it's so kind of socially active that it's not dealing in the kind of formality of placed sculpture. It's dealing with a kind of intervention in the culture itself. That's the thing that's exciting, and that's the thing that we don't have. It is the work that you're describing.
I think it's the ultimate placemaking. What's a place if you don't fix the problems?
Yeah, and I think that there's a time-based element in that that's really important, right? That's one of the things that's very, very hard for traditional forms of art to deliver on is something that's as fluid and as manipulative as those kind of politicized works, as they need to be in order to change the culture of the city.
So I had a question.
I guess I think there's a traditional art before traditional art. I'm not talking 19th century traditional art. I mean, wasn't art traditionally to, where's our Maori friend, to speak to the gods and make the rain happen, to protect the community, I mean, I think that art had those big plans and presence within a society.
Mary Jane,
before it became stuff in a gallery, too.
At the start of your talk, you defined art as a means of living life. And I think that's what you're talking about now, isn't it? That's an idea that we've become, I would have thought, quite profoundly disconnected from. And the examples that you've used in terms of the public art you've shown us are clearly connected with life in all sorts of ways. But don't we operate now with a concept of art that is not that is not a means of living life, but is actually something different?
Art's a pretty big thing, and there are thousands and thousands of artists, so maybe you're just looking at some of that art.
Would either of you like to comment on that?
Give me the question again, Simon.
What do you think art is?
Oh.
I'm going to try and sit
that.
down.
How do we get there so
It's
fast?
very hard to do when they're all looking away
Well,
from
how
me.
about defining what a public is? I think that's also a really difficult question to ask and to answer. So, yeah.
Defining what public is?
Yeah, it's a bit of a misnomer in terms of, definitions. That's something that you started off with the other day, actually, that if we tried to work out the definitions, we'd be here all day. And
Actually, that was Lewis.
That was Lewis. And nobody's particularly interested in the definitions. We're much more interested in the projects, the problems, and the outcomes. Yeah.
For the purposes of the discussion, though, public art is art in the street? Is art in public spaces? Is art that you don't go off to a special art place to look at or engage with? It's there in your normal life. Is that fair?
That's some of it.
That's some of it. And more of it is?
More of it is art that deals with a public consciousness, public identity, public questions.
So Mary Jane, one of the things that I have observed from your talk is that there is internationally a big emphasis on temporary work right now. Why do you think that is?
Temporary work?
Temporary work, and that's something that Nat, you touched on as well.
Temporary meaning things that are performative and happen in actions, or temporary meaning things that are built and don't last a long time?
Both of those things, I suppose. More, I suppose, less the traditional model of what people might think of as public art in terms of a bronze statue that stays for a long period of time and has a set existence. The nature of the works that you've described happen through time, and they don't necessarily last forever, although they might create lasting change.
Well, I think we're dealing with a contemporary art world where the genre of installation art, which is sometimes cited in a way that can't be there forever, right? Or performance art are things that we know as part of the avant-garde and the tools or ways by which artists make work. At the same time, some of the reasons that those artists are excited and using those ways of working is because they themselves are inspired by ancient and other forms by which cultures made work and communicated to their audiences. And there is something that happens in that vitality of the moment. And as someone who's commissioned and been involved in curating a lot of temporary work, I always find it so amazing that re-encountering some members of that audience can, a decade later, tell me exactly what something looked like and then how they felt and what happened in that moment, whereas we'd be hard-pressed to describe at that same level some things that we live with all the time. So I think that there's another human dimension in this temporary thing, that it makes us wake up at that moment and pay attention, and we know we have to hold on to that experience.
Isn't that the point that the permanence is found in the effect rather than in the artifact? Sorry, isn't that the point that the permanence is found in the effect rather than the artifact, rather than in the object?
If the art is the art is the social project, a lot of people would say, I imagine, what is it that makes converting a bank into a performance area or an artist's space, what makes that a work of art? What makes a project for reparations for torture victims a work of art? What's your answer to that?
Maybe it isn't a work of art. Maybe it's the work of the artist.
There's a useful definition of art, that art is what an artist says it is.
No, I didn't say that.
No,
I didn't say that at all.
So you're
These are artists who take on a sense that they are responsible and engaged in society and crafting society to move to a better place when brought in union with a community that also becomes part of that mission, and by which some of those stands and ideas are formed. And so that work of the artist to imagine getting to a better place and the tools and the processes by which that can happen, and creating inspiring experiences through that process that help us kind of realize not only that you might get to that goal, but why that goal matters, is all part of that larger lived process that the artist is doing. But I think very much a definition by which these artists and many artists today define their role in society. So I'm not playing a game with a work of art is art because the artist said it was, because that's a different point. And that's actually a kind of polar opposite of what it is. But an artist having a serious job and making a difference in the world is for the artist to believe that art is good for something.
Is there a difference between some of the works you've shown us and a work like the Puerto Rican one, where the community in the jungle that is meant, the authorities would really rather like to disappear, painting it green to ostensibly make it disappear obviously has an enormously profound sense of community building and ratcheted into it. And yet, I guess because there's a visual element to it, it felt to me a little more obviously like it's an artwork as well as a community project. It's an artwork as a community project that is easier to understand in both those terms.
I think that's the first reaction, and that's a strategic process that the artist engages in order to capture attention and give us something that is both fun and funny and also visual and attractive. But Cheme would tell you today that it's not about the color. The color just seduces you in. Now what's it about? It's about the museum the community has created, the sports area that the community has created, the resources that have come in from the university to work with students, the ongoing work of others in that place, and the community gaining a sense not just that their homes are not going to be taken away, but that it is a place of pride and respect and to build that community. So it's just a trick. You fell for the trick, but yeah.
Yeah. I
Green
think
is
It's a good trick.
It's interesting too. I was having a conversation along these lines exactly this morning in relationship to another project you talked about to me the other day, the Phillips community, where you had basically, it seemed, made a series of signs that pointed to the history of that space. I might have misinterpreted
those are.
that.
I don't really want to talk about something to an audience that they don't have the
never mind,
visuals
never mind.
for.
Anyway,
but just to correct that, that's an American historical marker.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Okay, but
We were not-
the point I was going to make really was that, particularly for a New Zealand audience or an audience in Auckland, where there's a tradition for Māori and Pacific communities, or an oratory tradition, and music and storytelling plays a really big role. I think it's a real distraction to think that to be trapped in the visual space, because equally there are projects that are storytelling projects that might not have a visual outcome. A nice
or also
example,
ephemeral, or could seem temporal or
Exactly.
temporary.
and a nice example of that is
make them feel
Te Oro,
less.
That's right.
that we just launched in May. So my mic just dropped out again. Okay.
If you keep your
If I keep my chin down like this, it's just fine. So yeah, Te Oro that we opened in May, and there are a series of 6 sound cones associated with that building, and the sound cones were generated, 3 of them by the 3 iwi groups that were involved in the building, and the other 3 were generated by the community. So there's a whole bunch of recordings that happened out on the water, that happened at whaikorero and speech making, and all kinds of different situations and scenarios. And those are the sounds that bring that building to life. And while there are visual manifestations in that building, that's not the sole
And
part
there's
of the work.
that marvellous oral work of Rachel Shearer on the Te Wero Bridge, which has no visual manifestation at all, really.
Yep.
And,
You're talking about Sounds of Sea, which
That's
is
right,
down
yes.
the Auckland foreshore.
Yeah. I thought this might be a good point to mention Michael Parakowha, because you know, if you walk along the Auckland waterfront, it is very hard to spot, to identify art from tangata whenua, and yet when Michael Parakowha says, I'm going to do this, there's an outcry about, well, that's not good enough, that's not what we want. Of course, that outcry has now died down almost completely. But that's a work of quite profound social engagement that he's proposing, and that I think probably will be built now, and I'm so pleased about that, where you guys have been involved, and there has been I mean, it's not a work that will change lives in anything like some of the projects that Mary Jane has talked about, but it has a very profound social role, doesn't it? Social engagement in what he's proposing there.
Yes, I think you're right. There is something quite courageous in what Michael's proposing, and I think that one of the things that's very compelling about that work is the use of the vernacular architecture that so many of us recognise. It's a really ubiquitous kind of architecture, and it has resonance right across New Zealand, in fact. So I think that while in doing so, he's mining a really, really rich vein. And there are houses across Auckland that have been renovated. They've had the back ends taken out of them and made into very, very different kinds of homes. But celebrating the vernacular of that New Zealand architecture and juxtaposing it or putting it next to something that is elaborate and glorious and exotic, something that is from elsewhere. Putting those two things together is quite genius. So,
Nat, can I ask you about Britomart, just directly? Britomart is a project that has obviously changed the downtown area so significantly, both in itself and because of what it told Aucklanders about what we might be able to be in this city. And it's done it in all sorts of ways, but public art is not really one of them. Do you think that's fair, or?
Yeah, I think in part it's fair. I mean, there's an interesting history in the city of large format commercial projects and kind of urban change being kind of weak but being justified by art. And so I think, Richard Deacon's beautiful sculpture at the back of ASB Tower justifying this kind of monstrosity thrust upon the city. And so in some ways Britomart started from the opposite end, but yet squirreled in there are some very important assertions of place and of people. And I'm thinking about the work in Takutai Square in particular, but also the Po in the centre of the showcase buildings, which are both to do with the kind of collective whole, but also to do with the individual. And for Peter, who kind of generated this project, those are profoundly important parts of the change at Britomart.
Right. Does the council have a view of that? No?
I don't speak for the council.
Okay.
I don't know. There's some councillors here. Perhaps we could ask.
Okay. You don't? There is a council policy on public art, isn't there?
I'm holding it here.
Yeah, that's right.
This is my well-weathered copy.
So can you give us the single sentence takeout on that, or is there not one? Or give us the brief version.
The brief version. Look, I think the city is really, really lucky to have the public art policy. It came out in 2013, September, and I guess, and I'm going to segue actually, because you gave me that serve a moment ago about tangata whenua and the presence of Māori identity. And one of the things that really is roundly endorsed in the policy is a place for Māori. And one of the things that I'm really, really proud of is I'm going to hold it up. There we go, nice cover image. This is a work by Henrietta Nicholas. She's Te Arawa. And this was actually a reasonably late intervention, the artist being involved in this project, but it does give visibility to Māori identity in a way that is really very, very strong. And it's one of the things that's enabled in the policy. So that's one of the things I'm really proud of, and I think that we can all be proud of as Aucklanders.
And the work you're specifically talking about, that's on the Warrenamani Bridge over to the Parnell Baths, isn't it? But you're not talking about the bridge per se, you're talking about all of this.
Yeah, so there's a motif.
Which they can't see, so you explain it.
There's a motif on the bottom here, and also the bottom shape of the bridge is shaped like almost like a waka. On the sides of the bridge, there's glass panes, and they also have a motif that runs along these glass planes, and when the light comes up, when the daylight comes across, these shadows and the light play changes during the course of the day. So it's a quite quiet work, but it's also a very robust and strident work in a whole bunch of ways. It's one that's visible from the waterfront, from the water, from the footpath. Yeah.
Nat, do you have a great thing you'd love to see happen in public art in Auckland?
Yeah, look, thinking about the Parakowhai project, one of the things that's really exciting about that is that it's a really powerful model for patronage in the city, and patronage is a kind of fundamentally important part of the discussion of public art. Sorry, I'm going to hold it. It's extraordinary that this is a piece that is given as a gift to the city rather than as an apology to the city. I think, though, that there's a drastic need for enormously more bold and speculative art in the city. You know, Parakowhai is an extraordinary start. He's a very brave and very intelligent artist, but most of our work is incredibly kind of polite and not nearly as kind of socially speculative as it might be. And I think there is space, you know, if I think about Chicago and the impact of Anish Kapoor, for instance, the impact of one work on art in an entire city is, the potential of that impact is enormous. And so if I could wish for one thing, it would not be 20 good pieces, it would be one fucking extraordinary one.
Can you explain socially speculative?
I think, yeah, of course.
Could you just define public art for us? That'd be great.
Sure. I think...
Well, I don't think socially speculative is a usual phrase. So,
Okay.
yeah, so I'm curious.
I think one of the things that I'm certain of is that cities are no longer kind of seen as collections of kind of fixed artifacts. They're not solid, concrete things that we aspire to. Cities are systems and mechanisms of change. And art, in order to have relevance in that space, needs to be just as fluid, and it needs to be incredibly kind of manipulative, investigative, and aggressive in its investigations. And in order to be most potent, I think it needs to make propositions about the society in which it's operating. And those propositions might be pointed backwards in time, but they might also be pointed forwards in time. But I think the fact that it makes those propositions, that's what defines it as extraordinary. That's what defines it as important. And that's what gives it currency in the city.
And the Anish Kapoor and Millennium Park in Chicago is
different game.
Mm-hmm.
But I think, the point there was one of kind of scale and impact. And I think the other thing that we need to talk about is the importance of public art understood, its impact being understood in aggregate rather than in isolation. That the kind of huge bang is needed there at one end of the spectrum, but every part of that spectrum is important. And that spectrum doesn't just deal with scale, it deals also with the intensity of engagement. So at one end is work that is intensely kind of personal and experiential, and at the other end is work that deals with us as a whole, as a kind of people.
I've heard you argue quite often that we can't get hung up on the idea of waiting for the one big thing. That
Yeah.
I think you're talking architecture usually
Yeah.
when you say that.
Yeah.
But actually in the public art sphere, it is the one big thing.
Yeah, look, absolutely.
Hannah, do you have a view of that?
Can I just to go back on that? I mean, if you're going to propose that Britain art is this thing that is the kind of change agent that provokes and contaminates the city around it and draws the rest of the city up with it, then we need the equivalent of that in our public art, the thing that drags the rest with it.
Right.
I guess one of the challenges of working as council in this space is that we have a responsibility to a whole lot of different publics. We have a responsibility to a whole lot of different ideas of what we mean by local. So, you know, local in Chicago might mean the city, it might mean the state, or it might mean a neighbourhood. And that's something that Auckland is very much in the process of defining for itself. You know, we've come out of this context of a bunch of legacy cities, and we are finding a voice for ourselves as a much bigger idea of a city. But one of the things
And that can't mean everything has to be downtown at all.
Well, exactly, and I think that one of the pieces of work that we're going through at the moment is looking at the assets that we do have in the public art space and finding out where they are. So the West was very, very strong in investing in this particular way. Other parts of the city weren't so strong, so we're finding that there are pockets of activity, and we do have a responsibility to cater
to the whole of Auckland and all of the little bits of Auckland that, that are part of that. Some of those are rural, some of those are urban. So I don't know that that there is one ring to rule them all, if you know what I mean, to quote our great friend.
One of the great problems that art faces in the public sphere is that what Nat just said, that it should provoke, that it should disconcert, that it should change everything, is a very hard thing to create and make real in a democratic process where we all rightly expect that we should have our say. But the consequence of that can so often be bland pieces that sit in the corner and don't offend anyone, except that they're so offensive because they're not saying anything.
Look, I think that public art is, because it lives in public space and because it's something that you encounter without necessarily asking for it to arrive, it's always controversial. It's always going to be that way. It's something that you rub up against in your daily life, and that's one of the reasons that it's such a powerful tool. But it's also one of the reasons that makes it challenging. And I think that it has the potential to hold up a lens, a mirror, I should say, a mirror to ourselves, and ask us, ask of ourselves, who are we, where do we come from, and how do we feel in relationship to these things that we encounter.
And that's John Dewey, isn't it?
That is. That's why we do it.
What's your great example of that in Auckland that you've done? The mirror.
Well, there's a work that we'd like to make that includes a mirror. It's on the work program at the moment.
But I heard that aspiration and that benchmark of what was art, and Simon re-acknowledged it, that it, fit into this definition of what is resonant within self and larger, and either under you or others, there's a lot of stuff you've made.
Yep.
And so just personally,
so
what personally moves you among the collection of the Auckland Council and the greater city of Auckland?
At the risk of repeating myself, and it's very hard for me to have favourites, and I hate that kind of question. But anyway,
we'll assume you have many favorites. But
I do have many favourites.
An experience with
what
you love.
The example that I would have is the one that I have, in fact, already mentioned, and it's the Henrietta Nicholas Bridge. And so that's that one there, in case you've forgotten. And it's because I think it's shifted my notion of what I think Auckland is and what Auckland is capable of being. It is, in some senses, it's heroic, and in some senses, it's very humble. And it is highly visible. It's highly visible to me and the routes that I travel in the city. It's something that I look up to, literally. It's soaring up above us. I know it was a very complex kind of a project. It's got multiple landowners. It goes across a railway line. It goes across a road. So New Zealand NZTA and Auckland Transport and Parks and Kiwi Rail, and all those people were involved. So from a stakeholder perspective, it was challenging. So anyway, if I had a project that I think kind of symbolises where we're at the moment, it also symbolises for me what's capable under the new public art policy, and that's why I find it compelling. But those reasons are probably not necessarily very interesting to
personally.
But personally, it's one of the things that I think that Auckland has got going for it right now, that enables us to form a new sense of who we are.
Do you have an answer to that question, Nat?
Look, I think I grew up skateboarding all over Terry Stringer, so that will always have a place in my heart. Is it Molly McAllister's Warrior at the bottom of Queen Street with its back? Molly McAllister's Warrior at the bottom of Queen Street with its back to the post office, facing out sternly into the harbour. I think there's kind of enormous force, enormous potency in that piece.
Yeah.
Mary Jane, have you spotted something that you think, gosh?
No, not here, because I haven't seen, I'm sorry to say. But I just want to kind of remediate this notion that that while I was showing these examples, that there isn't a place for objects or for the one great object or for a great object and then other objects. Because I think that what I'm trying to express is that there is a vast continuum of ways in which art is made and artists work. And some are meaningful, that we might agree on, or affords meaning better than others, and that I would put into the good category. And some are great for some other reasons that speak. And so it can be a thing, which is also permanent. And since it's been evoked here, and if anybody doesn't know what Anish Kapoor in Chicago looks like, think of a very giant kidney bean, which is bulbous and super shiny and cost a whole lot of money to be put there because it's solid and polished and just made in perfection. And for those reasons, it took me several years to cross the street to look at it. Because, now, I don't know exactly what it costs, but I do know that there were additional costs like bolstering up roads and then the spot where it was to even support this thing. But I did eventually look at it, and look at it close. And by then it had already become this symbol of the city. So that's maybe in one way what you mean about, evoking the kind of great thing that then everybody knows this is an identifier, or commercial enterprises pick it up and use it as a kind of city logo. But I have to say, for an object which is about as opposite from the examples that I was showing you, particularly around Chicago in the end of that presentation, it is a work that allows the city to see itself. It is a work which somehow, because of that artist's demand for perfection, because of a kind of truly embedded philosophical Buddhist notions that come through his own personal background and become part of that work of how we see ourselves within the city reflected, see ourselves within the millions of other people, because people just go to it like a magnet, right? And on the one hand, that's popular and would make it seem, therefore, not such a great work of art, that it was maybe just too populist. But the great thing about that is that when you look at yourself within this object, and you can't help but look into it, it is truly a mirror, that you see yourself with everybody else. And when you see yourself with everybody else in the middle of this thing, in this vortex that then replicates you and everyone ad infinitum, it is no longer a funhouse mirror. It's very profound. And that's magic, and that is a reason why, if something like that can bring every tourist, every citizen, everybody into not only being satisfied to be identified with it, but literally coming and being in the piece, then bravo, that artist did a great job.
Now we do have, we are running slightly over, I'm sorry, but we do have time for a couple of questions. So, and I believe there are microphones somewhere. And just while somebody's working out a question they might like to ask, you may not know, we have our own giant Anish Kapoor in Auckland.
Oh, I don't.
Yes.
No.
And it's on a private sculpture farm, which I can imagine what you think. It's not a bean. It's a funnel. It's red. It's enormous.
Great.
Magnificent, whichever way you look at it. But
open to the public?
But only by special arrangement on certain days. Basically, no.
Yes.
But it is.
Yeah, rich people do that. I
Not
can
public
also
art.
say statues of Abraham Lincoln in Chicago are pretty darn good.
Yes, so we have a question just coming over here. Susan's just reaching it through. Good.
Hi there. My question kind of pertains to that sort of definition of what is art, and perhaps some things that I would consider art that a lot of people tend to push to the side, things like architecture, fashion, things like that. I'm kind of thinking of things like what, for me, in a way, have defined certain aspects of cities like New York. When you look at, the works of Bill Cunningham and his photography, and perhaps your thoughts on the idea of things like fashion, public parks, architecture, things like that, and maybe how they can be viewed as public art, rather than simply what we would think of when someone says art. You think of pieces in a gallery or the bronze statues that are dotted around.
I want that question.
You want that question, Nat?
I'm an art school dropout, and I'm an art school dropout for that very reason, because the closer I got to art, the further away I got from it, and the closer I got to architecture, because I thought that architecture was this thing that would drag it from those galleries, from those farms, and into all of our lives, drag it out into the most aggressive kind of environment that I knew of, which was the city, and still try to make it thrive. Simon threatened to ask me backstage whether why there was no art in City Works Depot yet, and my answer was going to be "fuck you, Simon." The City Works Depot is a project that with which we've tried to reach into the guts of the city itself and reconfigure what it believes of itself and how it has come to be and how it might yet be. And so, from my point of view, that very much is a kind of art practice.
I love that I didn't even need to ask.
I know. It was such a good question. I've been sitting here the entire time terrified of that question and not listening to you.
Another question?
Yes,
Tēnā koutou. Mary Jane, thank you for your talk tonight. A lot of the inspirational public art that you talk to us about is challenging a status quo which is perpetrated by a political administration or ignored by them, so they're not doing anything themselves to change it. In light of that, what role do you think governments like Auckland Council should play in public art?
It's very hard as a U.S. citizen to cozy up to that. We're very mistrustful of government, and we don't think that government does a very good job of bringing art about, and we do it ourselves. And anyway, they don't give us any money, so it's not a problem. So yeah, the role. Yeah, would we like some money and handled well? I suppose, but I don't think they have a role. I think they have a role in getting out of the way.
It's a different economic model, though, isn't
exactly,
it?
Exactly.
We have in this town and in this country some magnificent philanthropists in the arts who are extraordinarily generous, and one or two of them are in the room. And it's
These
fantastic.
are individuals. This
That's
is not
right.
government.
Yeah. But by and large, they will all tell you that they are worried about where the next generation is coming from, of philanthropists, and that sense of private commitment to funding in the arts is so different in this country from America. It's so because for historical reasons.
I think this is why artists are taking it into their own hands. I mean, I've experienced a generation that, unlike my own, is not about not-for-profits and working through the philanthropic enterprise. It's about them becoming entrepreneurs on their own and creating those economic generators. Yeah.
It's a whole other discussion, that one.
A question over here. Mary Jane, for you, from what I could tell from most of your examples, they seem to be artist-led interventions. In the context of Auckland, where our public art policy has undergone some change or a reboot, how successful, in your experience, have governing bodies such as council being in leading change, cultivating and delivering the autonomy back into our communities, to participate actively without the need for artist-led intervention?
Didn't you just answer that?
Okay, didn't catch all of it, but how successful has councils been in making change?
Yeah, in any example where a governing body, whatever it may be, is looked to lead change around, you know, those empowered communities?
Yeah,
who
I mean, I would say in my experience that it's been phenomenally hard won, but amazing partnerships with government, which has not been art, which has not been the art department of the government. And we in Chicago also have a public art, Percent for Art program, which is run by the city Cultural Affairs Department. But they're not the ones who really get involved in the public issues. It's when artists and citizens can join with, for instance, the environmental department to force change and to enable change, can work with, yes, even the police department in order to do that. You know, so where artists are having conversations outside an art-to-art conversation and who owns the art and who's in charge and whose decision gets made, but where you really have to cross over that boundary as to, are we talking about art or not, and we transcend that art into where art becomes part of a bigger conversation, that there have been phenomenal, progressive, important changes. So, you know, within departments of education and, yeah, others. So, yes, those are governmental departments, and those are important sectors that have resources and power and can make change. And when that can be grounded in an art conversation and where art matters, then I always find that it's a stronger conversation than when art people are talking to art people.
Thank you. I'm now going to call up onto the stage the Deputy Mayor, Penny Hulse, who's going to make the concluding remarks. Because this is, after all, a council event. Welcome back, Penny.
Tricky stairs.
Yes.
Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you for a very, very interesting evening. It's a little bit cold, so I won't talk for too long because I think people do need to get up and talk to each other and warm up. But thank you for the chance just to say a very few words. And I do have to, I got back from London yesterday afternoon, so my head is still full of that kind of really interesting experience of the vibrant city, from the very micro bubblegum pictures on the Millennium Bridge through to the sort of the grandeur of the architecture and everything as I cycled around and looked at it. So getting back to Auckland, I think there are some really key messages that I've heard tonight. And Mary Jane, I just want to thank you for really stretching our heads around the definition of art. I've loved the breadth of that discussion. And I just want to, if you'll indulge me for a second, I guess to just talk about some very quick ideas and remind people that council isn't quite the cultural desert that we might appear from time to time. We've got our artists working in South Auckland with communities, looking at how to encourage waste management and reuse and recycling. It's our artists who are driving some of those really great works with our communities. Out west, and thank you for the mention of West and Kia ora May, we have a very, very strong history of stream regeneration driven by artists and making art on the sides of our streams and bringing our communities in that way. We've got a very proud tradition of, again, I'm sorry, my experience is out west, of the council requiring for every public building a component of that funding to be put towards art in the building. And I'm not talking statues, I'm talking the design, the handrails, the design of the lintels, the effect of the building to be an artwork. And finally, and I may be provocative here and get myself into trouble, but it's a good way of kind of testing the waters. I believe that council laws and elected members need to step off the stage when it comes to making decisions about art. Thank you. We are gifted in Auckland with an extraordinary arts community, and I just want to acknowledge Mihi, who's here, Naomi McCleary, people who taught me out west that we vote a budget for public art and then we step away and we leave the decisions to artists. And I think if we can keep that going in Auckland, we will have a much better outcome. The Parekowhai is a really good example where, to be absolutely honest, the politics almost subsumed and submerged this incredibly exciting project and the very generous benefactors in a storm of political shit, and I think that will not be good for Auckland. So finally, Mary Jane, thank you for reminding us how critical art is to our lives, for reminding us that we need to be brave, that we need to engage bravely, and when we have the transit cloud in, in New Lynn, which many of you might have just thought was council making a dick of themselves or otherwise, you know, these things which challenge us, and for anyone who doesn't know, yes, the cloud does look like a penis, but you have to stand sort of very close to one bit of wall and look, you know, through sort of some slightly strange lenses to only see it that way. It's a lovely piece of public art. It's a really beautiful innovation in a really gritty area in New Lynn, and it's wonderful. We need to be brave with art. We need to stretch our imagination. We need to place make with art. We need to put our artists in the centre where they belong of transformative social change. And thank you for reminding us of that, and for the panel to fielding some pretty challenging and difficult questions. And as always, to our wonderful Simon Wilson, who inspires us, challenges us, and brings joy. Thank you.